Hello, my friends, Evolutionary Energy Arts family. So, guys, this is some fascinating stuff. When we start looking really deeper into the mythologies and the histories, and then see modern science coming out with new discoveries that points to the fact that these ancient myths and legends that are so uniform all around the world, they definitely may have a basis in truth, and perhaps everything we've been taught has been absolute BS. So here we see, study reveals Earth and Moon aren't made of the same stuff, challenging prevailing theory of how the Moon formed. You know, if you're of an age like myself, or even much younger, you probably were taught that the Moon came from the Earth, that perhaps there was some big impact or what have you, and a piece of the Moon got pulled from the Earth but was close enough to the main body that it came in its orbit and it was locked into that orbit. As we know, we only see half of it exposed to us at any one time. It stays in this locked orbit. Some things that are unusual about the Moon are also the fact that it is relatively large proportionate to its its planet that it orbits. And we don't typically see a moon this relatively large around a planet in proportion. There's a lot of other things that are very weird about it as well. A new study conducted by scientists at the University of Mexico revealed the Earth and the Moon have different oxygen isotopes compositions, and so therefore they're not identical in oxygen as previously believed. Researchers said the finding challenges present studies and understandings of how the Moon formed. The giant impact hypothesis, or the Theia impact, suggests that the Moon formed from the ejecta of a collision between a Mars-sized planetesimal Theia and an early Earth Gaia about 4.5 billion years ago. Debris emitted from the massive clash was then bound by gravity, eventually forming as the Moon. Well, this new study shows that's not the case because, interestingly enough, the way the isotopes are, the Moon probably formed farther out in the solar system, farther away from the sun, and more than likely, from what this article is saying, perhaps out like around Saturn, or out in that area, even farther out. So that's super curious stuff, because there are some out there that say that our sun that we have now is not the original sun, and that Saturn was the original sun. And we see evidence of Saturn worship, most definitely in other cultures. And some think Saturn is Satan, in a sense. There's all these different myths and legends and theories. One thing that is really interesting is that when the astronauts landed on it, the Moon rang like a bell. And so why would the Moon ring like a bell? Perhaps it's not solid. The other thing that's really interesting is that if you look at the mass of the Moon in proportion to the Earth, it's lighter. And so, again, that has led people to think maybe it's not solid all the way through, or maybe it's not comprised of the same materials as we were led to believe. So the question comes then, how did it get here? Is it an artificial satellite? When you start to look into some of the oral traditions and the traditions of the Native American people, as well as many others, including the Greeks and the Etruscans, they all have legends of a time when the Earth was moonless, when there was no moon. And interestingly enough, people have tried to date it and figure out, well, when was it brought here? Well, looking at the legends, if you deduct the time frames that they're talking about, it gets really close to, as you see this article here, 11,713 years ago. That's pretty precise. But what's really curious about that dating is it takes us back to the Younger Dryas period, which was a massive period of die-off and big change on this planet. So that is super curious. Okay, so did something happen to the Earth that caused it so that it needed to be stabilized, and were there intelligences that brought the moon in to stabilize the Earth? We know the Earth is tilted, at an angle that varies slightly with the seasons and with the precession of the equinoxes. And so was the Earth maybe not always tilted? Was there some sort of major impact event that twisted it and shifted it? Very interesting stuff. And as we see here, the intriguing problem of the Younger Dryas. What does it mean? What caused it? So, this again is in that 12,800 to 11,500 years ago. And there's so many other things that keep coming out in this timeline. And we just saw recently, about a week ago, I reported on an article that showed that there was massive destruction and big impact in the Middle East in this time frame. Scientists believe there's a gigantic crater in Greenland where something hit Greenland and actually caused the entire ice sheet to just, basically get decimated, impacted, evaporated, raising the water level all over the planet. Many people believe this is the timeline in which Atlantis went under. Was it the impact of the Younger Dryas that caused the destruction of Atlantis as well? All these things are very, very curious when we see it. And there's evidence, if we look at the Carolina Bay phenomenon, you see that, that Greenland impact hypothesis could definitely explain perhaps why we have all these craters, over here in Nebraska, also on up over here up in Canada, down all along the East Coast. These things look like impact from a myriad of asteroids coming in, turning into meteors, perhaps something that broke up into many, many pieces, perhaps something that impacted and debris went back up in the air. It was so violent. And then set debris all over. As we see these, they're all over the place. This was a major, major event. And in fact, the Sumerian records talk about this event, and that the deities, Enlil and Enki and all the Annunaki, they knew it was coming. Now, did they know it was coming, or did they actually unleash it? We don't really know that either. The Babylonian flood myth is much older than the biblical account, by anywhere between 1,500 years and a couple thousand years older. The biblical account comes from the Babylonian account. And we actually have volumes of material now, hundreds of thousands of these tablets. And many, many different scholars have translated it. Not just one, many, many, many scholars are able to translate these things now, and it's consistent. So the Anunnaki actually got off the planet when the event happened. And Enlil, who was in charge of things over his brother Enki, well, he just wanted to let it happen and be done with humanity as a whole. But Enki warned, in the story, he warns one person, one family, and tells him to build the ark. And that's where the biblical story comes from. So humanity's saved, and Enlil is upset because he wanted it to be wiped clean and perhaps to start all over again. As we know, the Sumerian story, humanity is a slave race for these particular Anunnaki. And Anunnaki, again, is more of a general term about those that come from the heaven to earth. Or we could look at that as the fallen ones, right? In a sense, because they are coming from the heavens, everything that's out there, down to the planet. So interesting, is it not, how all this coincides at the same time? Here we see Michael Tellinger, who's done tons of work on this, talking about a time before the moon was in the sky. Many ancient people spoke about a time before the moon was in the sky. Aristotle did. Democritus did. Anaxagoras did. Apollonius of Rhodes did. Hippolytus, and many more. So many of these great Greek minds knew about these times and about these stories. Now, this statement might take a lot of people and make them incredulous. Now we know the moon is not what we see, that a hologram hides the true body behind it. And I have to share with you guys that I experienced that about 1 year ago right now. I was watching the moon with a friend in North Carolina. We were just staring at a big full moon, and it went blank. And all the craters, all those little things we see, disappeared, and it was blank, perfectly blank. We looked at each other, we looked back up, and then all the craters and everything else came back on. I wouldn't have believed it. I would have thought I was hallucinating or something, or having a vision. But, the other person saw it too. We saw the exact same thing. It's like somebody turned the switch off for a moment and turned it back on. So is the moon really some sort of ship? Is it a mothership? Is it here because of that impact event? And is it actually stabilizing our orbit? Or perhaps that is the point where the Watchers, right? All the legends of the Watchers, in Italian witchcraft, they're called the Grigori. And it's well known that there are these beings of more than one race, including the Draco, as well as others, including divine beings as well, like the archangels and others as well. So there's all different types of beings. There's not just one type of being. There's many, many, many different types of beings. But is this perhaps where the Watchers watch from? Or at least some of them. Is this perhaps a ship? Is it perhaps, the mothership that's been there all along? So the period when the Earth was moonless is probably the most remote recollection of mankind. So Democritus and Anaxagoras taught that there was a time when the Earth was without the moon. Aristotle wrote that Arcadia in Greece, before being inhabited by the Hellenes, had a population of Pelagesians, and that these aborigines occupied the land already before there was a moon in the sky above the Earth. For this reason they were called Proslenes. Apollonius of Rhodes mentioned the time when not all the orbs were yet in the heavens, before the Danai, interesting race there, and Deucalion races came into existence, and only the Arcadians lived, of whom it is said that they dwelt on the mountains and fed on acorns before there was a moon. And interestingly enough, the Cherokee remember the moon coming and being put in place. There's legends from many, many Native American tribes as well. And in fact, according to some of them, the ones that put the moon in place are the Draco. They're the reptilians. And there's more than one form of Draco. There are also the Nagas who live inside the Earth, more of a 5D realm. So very interesting legends that we see. Is the moon really a mothership up in our sky? Or was it moved here in order to basically stabilize the Earth after a great cataclysm that happened just about 11,700 years ago? Interesting stuff, my friends. If we take into account all the accounts, because they are global, coming from all sorts of people, there must be some truth in it. As always, my friends, thank you for your support on Patreon and Ko-Fi. God bless and namaste.